it's B. In today's video and newest edition in my Women of Survival Horror series, I will be talking about Heather Mason, the protagonist of Silent Hill 3, a game and series I'm sure need no introduction if you clicked on this video. Just in case you do need a little refresher though, Silent Hill 3 was released by Konami in 2003, made by the beloved Team Silent, which was responsible for the first 4 games in the franchise, which just so happened to be the best 4 games in the franchise. The story of Silent Hill 3 is notoriously complicated, involving reincarnation, rituals, and gods, and I'm going to do my very best to summarize Heather's lengthy backstory, as well as the general plot of Silent Hill 3, and as usual, that might take a while, so if you'd like to go get yourself a snack or some coffee, now would probably be a good time. I'll wait for you, don't worry. Before we get started, it's content warning time! Okay, so in this video I will be discussing both religious and childhood traumas as well as forced birth. I will try not to make the descriptions of these things too graphic, but as always, if you feel especially uncomfortable with the discussion of these topics, please do not feel the need to push through it. Take care of your mental health above all else, and don't feel obligated to sacrifice your mental well-being for the sake of watching my silly little video. With all that out of the way, let's get to talking about Heather Mason. Or Cheryl Mason. Or Alessa Gillespie. Heather herself is a 17-year-old girl at the time that this game takes place. It might seem a little bit weird that I worded it that way, but Heather has gone by many different names throughout her lifetimes. Notably as Cheryl Mason, the little girl and adopted daughter of Silent Hill 1 protagonist Harry Mason that gets lost in the town of Silent Hill at the beginning of the first game. And Heather is also Alessa Gillespie, the poor 7-year-old child from Silent Hill Origins who was sacrificed by her own mother, Dahlia, to birth God, something which is also discussed in the first game. When Alessa was set on fire during the ritual, it caused her so much pain that her soul split in two, creating Cheryl. When Cheryl came back to Silent Hill as a child with her father Harry, they get into a car accident at the beginning of the first game that separates them, and the car accident is caused by Alessa standing in the road on the highway. So when they get into the car accident, their souls go back together like this. It's very confusing. I'm just going to try to make a chart and put it on the screen, maybe so if you're a visual learner it will make more sense, because I can barely even understand it myself. Okay, so at the end of the first game, Alessa is finally forced to go through with birthing God by her mother after her failure to do so the first time when she was 7 years old. Which, by the way, after failing to give birth to God, Alessa was left covered head to toe in what should have been fatally bad burns, but was kept alive by both the malevolent God living within her womb, as well as by her mother Dahlia, who left her bedridden and in pain, lying in a dingy hospital room for 7 entire years, torturing her, drugging her, and inflicting pain upon her during this time because of Dahlia's resentment towards Alessa's inability to successfully birth God. I would like you to keep in mind that this is a 7-year-old child that we're talking about. I discussed more of this timeline in my video I did about Lisa Garland, because she was the nurse that cared for Alessa during the 7 years that she was left in the basement of El Camino Hospital. During those 7 years that Alessa remained bedridden, she willingly decided to endure her suffering so that her other self, Cheryl, could be happy and live her life fully. However, after so long of this torment, Alessa decided that enough was enough and called out to Cheryl, incentivizing her to return to Silent Hill, which Harry, Cheryl's father, agrees to do. He drives her to Silent Hill, though not really understanding why she wanted to go there in the first place, and as they enter the town, Harry sees the ghost, or astral projection, of a now 14-year-old Alessa walk in front of the car, which causes him to crash. In the instant that the vehicle collides with Alessa, Cheryl's soul is reunited with her, all a part of her plan to be whole again so that she can end her own suffering once and for all. However, before her plan to end her life can be realized, Dahlia, her mother, recaptures Alessa, who is finally whole again, and goes through with the initial plan to force her to birth God. After the final boss fight of the game, Harry Mason defeats the deity, and Alessa hands Harry a newborn baby, who is the reincarnation of herself, and therefore also the reincarnation of Cheryl, Harry's adopted daughter, who he was separated from at the beginning of the game. Very confusing. I know, I'm trying my best to explain this in a way that's digestible. Hopefully now you understand why this video took 2 months to come out. Harry raises the baby as his own and decides to name her Heather Mason. We've finally come full circle, but I'm afraid I have a bit more explaining to do. So, although Heather is the reincarnation of Alessa/Cheryl, she has no memory of these previous lives and is instead living as a normal, angsty teenage girl 17 years after the events of the first game. Now that we have her background out of the way, we can finally get to talking about the plot of Silent Hill 3 and how Heather fits into it. Silent Hill 3 begins in Heather's nightmare, taking place at the lakeside amusement park located in the town of Silent Hill, a place that we will visit again later on in the game. After suddenly waking up from her nightmare and finding herself having nodded off at a local burger joint, she gets up and begins heading towards the mall. When she arrives, she uses the payphone there to call her dad and let him know that she's going to start heading home soon. She realizes as she's standing there finishing out the conversation with her dad that an older man is staring at her. She hangs up the phone and shrugs at him in a kind of like, okay buddy, the phone's all yours, calm down kind of way. She begins speed walking away, looking over her shoulder at the man as she realizes that his intentions aren't just to use the payphone. He catches up to her and, calling her by name, introduces himself as a detective. Heather could not care less and continues walking away, rolling her eyes as the man continues trying to talk to her. Heather turns to him and tells him that her dad always told her not to talk to strangers, which, good advice, stranger danger and all that, and tells the man that she isn't interested in whatever it is that he has to say. The detective says that it's important and he needs to talk to her about her birth. He continues walking closely behind her, clearly freaking Heather out now, and she turns to him and says, "Are you still following me? Do I have to scream?" She enters a nearby women's bathroom and escapes out the window so that she won't have to walk by the detective again on her way out. She enters a clothing store and finds a handgun lying on the floor. She picks it up curiously, and as she turns, she sees a gigantic monster devouring the face of what was most likely an employee. Heather jumps into action, frantically shooting the gun at the monster, eventually killing it, and exclaiming, "What is this thing?" As she continues through the mall, that has suddenly shifted from a normal mall to a monster-infested version of itself, she eventually comes across Claudia Wolf, a woman who claims to know Heather and urges her to remember her true self. Heather is obviously confused by everything this woman says as she babbles on about God's paradise, birth, and whatever. Heather asks her if she was the one who caused the mall to change and become infested with monsters, to which Claudia says that it was the hand of God. Heather, as she tries to think about what Claudia said regarding her true self, begins to have a horrible headache and she makes an attempt to remember, but she says that she just doesn't get it. Me neither. Now is a good time to mention that Claudia Wolf is the High Priestess of the Order, which is the name of the cult from Silent Hill that is attempting to resurrect God, as well as the main antagonist of Silent Hill 3. As a child, Claudia was best friends with Alessa and viewed her as a sister since they spent so much time together growing up, prior to Alessa being set on fire by her own mother and everything. Speaking of Alessa's mother, being that she was the previous High Priestess of the Order, she also brainwashed Claudia, which has led her to attempt to succeed in accomplishing the task that Dahlia could not. We will talk a bit more about Claudia later. Back to Heather. After some more terrifying otherworld exploration, Heather finds herself back in the normal mall. She obviously decides to take the opportunity to get the hell out of there and begins heading for the subway before being stopped by Douglas, the detective from earlier. Heather accuses him of being on Claudia's side and storms off. The subway itself leads her back to the otherworld, a construction site, and eventually to an office building where she meets Vincent, who is an asshole. I mean, a priest of the order, but also an asshole. Heather briefly talks with him about his views on Claudia, especially since they follow the same religion. He says that he doesn't necessarily agree with her on everything, but Heather still gets a weird feeling about him. Which she should. Heather, continuing on her way, must defeat some more monsters, and eventually she finds herself back in the real world once again. She finally makes her way home to the apartment that she shares with her father. Walking in and immediately talking to her dad, who she sees looking toward the TV, his back to her as she enters the room, she realizes that he isn't responding to anything she's saying or even acknowledging that she's there. Curiously, she walks in front of him and sees that he's dead, clearly having been murdered, his mangled body still sitting slumped in his armchair. Heather kneels in the blood pooled at her father's feet and cries into his lap. As Heather stands, she realizes that there's a blood trail leading out of the room and up the fire escape to the roof of the building. She decides to follow it and finds Claudia there. Heather threatens Claudia, seething with rage and confusion, and she promises that she will get back at her. Claudia says that she only ordered the hit, she wasn't the one who actually killed him, and tells Heather that she needs to go to Silent Hill so that she will finally be able to understand. Claudia points out the monster that did it, and Heather kills it and heads back down to the apartment where she finds Douglas, who is in her apartment now. Heather gives him a piece of her mind and blames him for her father's death, saying that if he didn't find her at Claudia's command, this would have never happened, which is true. Riddled with guilt, Douglas decides to help Heather. The two of them move Harry's body onto the bed, covering him with a white sheet and a few lilies in a sort of mock funeral. She says to her dad's lifeless body that she's sorry, and Douglas pulls the car around. Heather meets him outside, and they begin their drive to Silent Hill despite Douglas's warning that revenge is not the answer. Heather does not really seem to care, and I don't blame her. As she meets Douglas by his car, he says that her friend, Vincent, came by to drop off a few things for her, including a map of Silent Hill as well as a notebook created by her father explaining everything to do with her past. During the lengthy car ride, Heather goes through this notebook and is understandably very confused and heartbroken, but seems to have known deep down that she was different somehow all along. She basically thinks out loud to Douglas as they drive, recounting to him all of her newly resurfaced memories of her experiences during her life as Alessa and how she came to be Heather. As she thinks back on her several lives, she grows more and more emotional and says, as if talking to her father, that she never got the chance to tell him how happy he made her, which is so sad I cry every single time I watch this cutscene. When the two arrive in Silent Hill, they decide to split up and Heather heads to the local hospital to begin exploring. She looks around the dilapidated rooms of the hospital and she finds many letters addressed to her written by a man named Stanley, whom Heather does not know. However, he seems to know her. His letters are filled with poetry about his love and devotion to her, and the letters are each accompanied by a doll and seem to appear in rooms that he anticipates that she'll be heading to next, implying that he's watching her and commenting on her movements. Heather Stalker's letters range from saying things like, "You exist for me," "I long for you, but you're so cruel, still I want you, Heather," "Heather, my most sacred lover, I'm always watching you no matter where you are or what you may be doing, I have never lost sight of you," and "I love Heather isn't enough for what I feel." It's unknown how old this man is, how he knows Heather's name, or how this obsession with her began, but I'd like to take this moment to remind you that Heather is a minor, and even if Stanley was familiar with her from her days of living as Alessa, she never aged beyond 14 years old in that life either. Within the hospital, Heather receives a call from Leonard Wolf, who's looking to speak with his daughter, Claudia. Yes, same Claudia, talking about the same woman. We will come back to Leonard in a moment, but for now just remember that he's Claudia's father, and Heather ends up killing him after meeting him in person as he becomes hostile towards her after finding out that she doesn't hold the same religious beliefs as the Order. When we return to our hotel room where we first parted ways with Douglas, instead of finding him, we find Vincent in our hotel room instead. Before Heather enters the room, we see a cutscene of Vincent arguing with Claudia in the hotel room about religious differences. Vincent says during this argument, "You hated your father, didn't you? I saw the way he hit you, kicked you, and made you cry. The memory of his cruelty is forever burned into my mind," to which Claudia responds, "Yes, and that's why we need God." Vincent says, "What you call faith is nothing more than a child crying out for love. That's why you're all alone." Harsh, Vincent. Harsh. Even if you're talking to Claudia, it's still mean. After Claudia leaves, Heather enters the room and is told by Vincent that Douglas would like to meet her at the church, which can be accessed through the amusement park. The same amusement park that Heather had in her nightmare at the beginning of the game. Within the amusement park, she finds Douglas, who's injured his leg in a fight with Claudia. Heather becomes quite upset and emotional seeing Douglas hurt in this way since she's gotten pretty close to him in the time following her father's death, and Douglas's subsequent choice to sacrifice his own life to help Heather avenge her father since he feels partially responsible for his death and has shown Heather that he is trustworthy. Heather lets down her walls for a moment during the conversation with Douglas as he sits in pain on the ground. I'm just going to play this cutscene for you because I think it's very telling about her character.
You old fool! Getting yourself hurt like that?
Sorry.
Why did you have to do that for me? What'll I do if you die?
What'll we do if this god thing gets born?
Come on. How powerful could a god from a dump like this be?
The tone on her voice comes across as scared and worried because it seems like now that she has no mother and no father, if she lost Douglas, well then she truly would be all alone. Douglas, a la Hopper and Eleven from Stranger Things, has become like her stand-in father figure and she's clearly very afraid to lose him. During this conversation, Douglas says that he feels like this is a pretty good reason to risk his life and just wants to help her out, and Heather admits for the first time that he doesn't need to feel responsible because she knows that it's not his fault that her father died, despite the fact that she said that earlier the same day. Heather had told him to his face that her father's death was his fault since he was the one who led Claudia to her and subsequently to her father in the first place. In my opinion, I feel like this shows a great deal of maturity on Heather's part, to be able to admit that even though I'm sure her emotions are just looking for anyone to throw blame at so she can make sense of such a horrible and tragic situation, to be able to admit that she was wrong to do so is a very mature and big thing of her to do. Douglas tells Heather that she reminds him of his son who was killed while carrying out a bank robbery, something that he blames himself for because, as he says, his pop was a penniless good-for-nothing. So, in a way, helping Heather seems to be his own way to make up for his failure to be a good father for his own son. Heather tells him that she'll take care of everything from now on while he rests, and that she'll be back to get him when it's all over. She says, besides, my dad's not around anymore, so only I can do this, which is just so heartbreaking. She's only 17. I mean, she's like a baby. It's really pitiful. As Heather turns and walks away, Douglas puts his gun up, pointed at the back of her head. Heather somehow must sense this and asks him what he's doing, and he says that maybe killing her there is the only way to end this nightmare, and she says, yeah, you might be right, and continues walking away, not even turning around to look at him and seeming content with either the outcome of living or dying. It doesn't really seem to matter to her either way at this point. As she continues further into the amusement park, she encounters the memory of Alessa, an otherworld version of Heather herself. Heather defeats her evil counterpart, and Alessa leaves behind a message on the ground scrawled in blood that explains that she was trying to kill Heather and therefore herself so that the god had no chance of being birthed and she can save the world from the endless pain of it being brought into existence. However, Heather says that although Alessa and her are technically the same person, they don't think alike at all, despite the fact that they both experience the same unbearable pain of fire and the torturous years in the hospital following the failure of the initial attempt of resurrecting God. As we near the end of the game, Heather enters the chapel and Claudia begins speaking with her. Heather, again, tries to appeal to Claudia by using her now regained memories of her life as Alessa to get Claudia to finally see the error of her ways, but Claudia persists. She says that God can fix all of the suffering in the world if she would just go through with the resurrection. But Heather, speaking with wisdom well beyond her years, says that suffering is a fact of life and you either learn to deal with it or you go under. Very wise words. Heather begins having what looks like extremely intense cramps as this conversation comes to an end. She falls to her knees and clutches her stomach, groaning in pain. Claudia tells her that God is growing within her, and she says, "You despise me, don't you?" To which Heather says, through gritted teeth, "You're damned right I do." Claudia says, "Good, because as we come to find out, this particular God is nourished by hatred, and Heather is absolutely filled with it." Eventually, as we venture further through the church, we find Vincent again. Heather grills him about why exactly he's helping her, and she becomes angry at him for seemingly using her to get back at Claudia. She's angry that he wants her to stop the birth of God all on her own because it would be inconvenient for him, though he's not really willing to do much to help other than give her cryptic clues here and there. The following cutscene is very famous, and I'm sure you've seen it before, but you're going to have to see it again because we have to talk about it. So I'm just going to let it play real quick.
Don't stand there looking so smug. You're the worst person in this room. You come here and enjoy spilling their blood and listening to them cry out. You feel excited when you step on them and snuff out their lives.
Are you talking about the monsters?
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
Oh no.
Don't worry. It's just a joke.
The fact that Vincent does all of this and then says it was just a joke and then gives the most disgusting smile I have ever seen in my life just makes me sick to my stomach. Like, you know this term like shit-eating grin? This is it. This is the shit-eating grin everyone's talking about. I hate Vincent. I know I said that before, but I want to say it again because I do. I hate Vincent and he sucks. You should hate him too. Later on in the cult's inner sanctum, we find Vincent and Claudia arguing once again, and Heather enters the room as they fight. Vincent commands Heather to kill Claudia, but Claudia is having none of it, so she runs up behind him while his back is turned to her and stabs him, yelling, "You'll go to hell." When Heather asks her what she's done, Claudia just says, "Nothing important." Okay. With him out of the way, Heather now confronts Claudia one-on-one. Claudia says, Alessa, I'm saddened that you didn't agree to this on your own, but I thank you for nurturing God with all of the hate in your heart. Heather tries to reason with her by saying a God born from hatred can never create a perfect paradise, but Claudia says that happy people can be so cruel. Is it so hard to believe that sympathy can be born out of pain and suffering? She acknowledges that for all the pain that she's caused her, she deserves no mercy, and says that she doesn't expect to be saved even after God is resurrected. Quick warning, it's about to get real gross. Sorry. Heather begins having unbearable cramps once more and falls to her knees, wailing from the pain. Claudia is standing there as Heather suffers and monologues about how excited she is that Judgment Day has finally arrived, and Heather, determined to stop the birth from happening, gets to her feet and with all the energy she has, yells,
Shut your stinking mouth, bitch!
at Claudia, then takes the necklace given to her by her father, opens the locket, and takes out a small red pill-shaped object and swallows it. According to her dad, this is a good luck charm, but he must have known all along that someday the Order may take her back and she might be used for their ritual once again. Upon swallowing it, she begins violently throwing up. As she stands up, at her feet lies the writhing, charred-looking body of the deity. Heather says, looks like God didn't make it, and Claudia begins to panic. If you thought that was gross, it's about to get even worse. Claudia picks up the lump of matter that is God and swallows it, claiming that if Heather, or Alessa as she calls her, can't birth God, then she's just gonna have to do it herself. She doesn't survive this process and her body falls limply through a hole in the floor. Heather follows behind her, and upon seeing that Claudia is already dead, she becomes upset, saying, "You can't be dead, I was going to kill you." Down in the depths of the church, we are introduced to God herself, a gigantic woman with blue scaly skin, straight black hair, and a body that's only composed of long blue arms, breasts, a spine, skeletal legs, and the pelvic bone. I'm making it a point to talk about the fact that this specific God is a woman because I feel like it has a lot to do with why this game is so focused on birth and fertility and just in general being a woman. Like the main antagonist and protagonist are both women, and so is the final boss. I think that's all pretty important. I just wanted to mention, since I forgot to talk about it when I originally recorded this video, I think it's really interesting that when Claudia is talking about this God who is a woman, she says, is it so hard to believe that sympathy could be born out of pain and suffering? And the reason I think that's interesting and significant to the fact that the God that she's talking about is a woman is that I think a lot of women have a kind of unspoken understanding of, women's issues. We've probably all been there, done that, or at least know another woman who has. So when a woman tells you, hey, this happened to me, most of the time you have some sort of way to relate back to that. So we kind of have this understanding of things that women suffer through that we share. So I think it's interesting that the God in this scenario is a woman, because I think that has a lot to do with the fact that this game is so centered around being a woman and fertility and birth and women's issues. Even if, you want to ignore all of that, it's still relevant, I think. Just my opinion, I guess. When Heather finally defeats God, she lets out a sigh of relief and begins kicking God's head. She takes a few exhausted breaths and walks away nonchalantly, saying,
I guess it's time to roll the credits.
But this coolness doesn't last long. She soon begins to cry, dropping to the ground and sobbing, saying "Dad" repeatedly, finally letting herself experience her grief after being strong for so long. As she walks up to Douglas, he asks her if it's really over, and I'm just going to play this cutscene because it's adorable, and I think it's like the best example of Heather's personality that we get to see in the whole game.
Heather, is it really over?
Not yet. You're still alive.
Heather, what Heather?
Oh! Just a joke.
You've got terrible
I'm
taste.
sorry.
Heather, did
You
you...
don't have to call me that. I'm not hiding anymore.
You want me to use your real name? What was it again?
Cheryl. The name my father gave me.
You gonna let your hair color go back too?
I don't know. Don't you think blondes have more fun?
And with that, the plot summary portion of this video is over, and so without further ado, let's talk about Heather and maybe a little bit about Claudia. You know, since she's also a woman and this is the Women of Survival Horror series. So we gotta talk about all the ladies. Heather, in my opinion, is one of, if not the only, women of survival horror that feels like a completely real woman to me. Not only that, but the respect and dignity that this game treats her with is something that is rarely seen in any genre, let alone the survival horror genre. As we've seen through my other videos on other women in survival horror, like Ashley Graham from Resident Evil 4, Fiona Belli and Daniela from Haunting Ground, and Eriko Christie from Illbleed, survival horror games do not typically have a pretty good track record of creating female characters without subjecting them to wild over-sexualization or making them very one-dimensional, leaving their personality and agency on the back burner while just having things happen to them without them ever really having a say in the matter. Silent Hill 3 is the perfect example of a female protagonist done right. Heather is complex, she's multidimensional, and above all else, she's believable. She has a real personality that isn't hidden within optional read-it-if-you-feel-like-it diary entries like Fiona's in Haunting Ground or the epitome of a centuries-old stereotype like Ashley Graham. From the second this game begins till the very end, Heather's personality is on full display.
Oh, forget it. This is way too gross. Who would even think of doing something so disgusting?
In the beginning of the game, while Heather tries to get away from Douglas, the detective at the mall after hanging up on the phone with her dad, I get a few different things from this scene. Firstly, that she has a great relationship with her dad, which isn't something that's too overwhelmingly common, but considering he's the only parent she's ever really known, it makes sense. And secondly, that she's all too aware of how creepy men can be and how careful women need to be while they're alone in public. As soon as she gets a weird feeling from the way that this man is staring at her, she begins acting accordingly, speed walking away, looking over her shoulder to make sure he isn't following her, and when she realizes that he is, as he begins trying to talk to her, she gives him the most amount of attitude possible and even directly confronts him, letting him know that she knows that he's following her, and she stands her ground even when it could be potentially dangerous for her to do so. It's a very brave thing to do. When she walks into the bathroom after properly telling off the detective in the hallway, she remarks while looking at her reflection in the mirror that she doesn't like mirrors because it's almost like there's an unknown world right on the other side and the person staring back at her isn't really her, just an imitator. If we didn't know all that we do about her past lives as both Cheryl and Alessa, we might think that this was just some normal teenage angst. In the apartment she shares with her father, her bedroom mirror is covered and her bathroom doesn't have a mirror either. It might just be her subconscious trying to find a way to make her remember her past lives that makes looking in mirrors so uncomfortable, but I don't think I've ever met a 17-year-old girl who likes looking at themselves in a mirror, even if they hadn't been rebirthed by themselves through supernatural means. And I haven't met a lot of those, so I feel like that says a lot. Heather, to me, seems very headstrong and stubborn. She talks with so much conviction and passion and emotion, no matter what that emotion may be. She can be sassy and give people an immense attitude when she's confronting them about things and can lose her temper quickly, but that's just life for a 17-year-old. She, in general, just has the personality of your average teenage girl. I mean, the "don't you think blondes have more fun" line definitely shows that no matter how much she's gone through, and as we've seen, she's certainly gone through a lot, she's still just a teenage girl despite her capacity to be extremely resilient when faced with hardship. Behind her sarcasm and occasional childishness, she really just seems like someone who had to grow up too quickly. Especially after she regains her memories from her lives as Alessa and Cheryl and experiences the death of her father, the only parental figure who ever truly loved her, she has to adapt to all of these new and traumatizing experiences really quickly and deal with them with an amount of maturity that is far beyond her years, truthfully, since she has no other choice. It's either deal with them now and face your problems, or go under, like she said. One scene that I think shows this really well is the resolve that Heather shows as she sets up a makeshift funeral for her father, placing his body beneath a white sheet and putting a few flowers on top. The fact that she would even think to do something like that and then say, "What else can I do? There's no one here to give him a decent burial," is something I would expect from someone in the mid part of their life, not someone who hasn't even finished high school yet. When Heather says following his funeral that when she finds Claudia, she will kill her herself, feels so determined. Teenagers aren't typically very close to their parents during these rebellious years, but it seems like Heather knew that Harry did everything in his power to give her a good life and to protect her, and that certainly wasn't lost on her. Despite how mature Heather is in some situations and how much she likes to insist that she isn't a child anymore, there are moments where Heather's immaturity shows itself as well, like refusing to wear a helmet because it would look too geeky even though it could potentially protect her from harm, but that doesn't mean that she can't see through people's bullshit. Heather treats everyone with a heavy dose of skepticism, and it seems like everyone is always guilty until proven innocent to her, which isn't a bad thing. Oftentimes, existing as a woman in the world, having this type of thinking can be our greatest defense mechanism. To assume that everyone has bad intentions until they prove otherwise, because putting too much trust that a stranger is a good person can lead us into potentially dangerous situations. Her skepticism towards Douglas is an especially good example of this. She assumed that he was up to no good and made sure to keep her guard up around him until he could prove to her that he posed no threat and was there to help. Without him being able to effectively prove that, she would have never bonded with him and would have likely maintained that same amount of standoffishness she showed towards him throughout the entire game. Heather is also an incredibly brave and quick-witted girl. There are times during the game where in order to solve puzzles, Heather needs to mix chemicals to create deadly gases and think on her feet to come up with solutions. She likes to read Edgar Allan Poe and Shakespeare, and she's incredibly sentimental, even if she doesn't really like to admit it because that would be pretty uncool of her. Heather even says, upon finding a shotgun, that it's gross, which is interesting to me, just because the fact that she says this implies that although she maybe doesn't believe in the use of guns or violence, that doesn't mean she won't resort to violence if that's what she needs to do to protect herself or the ones that she loves, like her dad. And Douglas. I know that was pretty lengthy, but as I said, Heather is an extremely well-written and actually a multifaceted character, which isn't something I come across too often making these videos about the women of survival horror. Heather, Alessa, Cheryl, whatever you want to call her, takes charge of her life. She has the agency, the independence, and the strength to get things done. She decides what she wants to do, how she wants to do it, even if she must fight herself or go against her own beliefs to be able to do it. She looks death in the face on multiple occasions, doing everything in her power to avenge her father and stop the birth of God for the good of the world, even if that means she must suffer immense pain to make it happen. The birth of God is something else I'd like to discuss briefly. As I said before, this is a matter of forced birth imposed by a religion that Heather, Alessa, or Cheryl never believed in. Something which she would need to sacrifice her own body for, even though it goes against her own beliefs and wishes and could possibly even result in her death. I mean, people using their faith to justify forcing women and even young girls to give birth against their will? Good thing Silent Hill isn't real and that could never happen in real life. In this case, Alessa was only 7 years old when her mother tried to use her own daughter's womb as a vessel for God, and years later her childhood best friend attempts to do the same thing to her in the name of the same God and the same religion, who they claim will end the suffering and pain of all, though the believers impose pain and suffering on unwilling sacrifices, on unwilling women in the name of those same beliefs. Make it make sense. Please, I'm begging you. Unfortunately relevant. I wish I could feel pity for Claudia. I really do. For everything she went through as a child and the abuse she suffered at the hands of her father. I understand that people cope with traumatic experiences in many ways. Some turn to therapy, and some turn to religion to try to make sense of what they went through and, in a way, make it seem like everything happens for a reason. Like they had to go through that trauma because they must suffer to be able to enter paradise and to be worthy of their God's mercy. They make sense of their beliefs by saying things like, is it so hard to believe that sympathy could be born through pain and suffering? I understand where she's coming from. I understand that she came this way through circumstances that were out of her control. But that's where my pity for her ends, because that doesn't excuse her actions or her imposing her beliefs on others and using them as a weapon to get her own way at the expense of the people around her. So, with that, we have finally reached the end of today's video. This is the longest a video has ever taken me to write. I started this script over 2 months ago, and just based on how heavy and unfortunately relevant a lot of the things I was going to have to talk about in this video are, I have been really struggling to find a way to write about it and have been kind of procrastinating this video because of that, so sorry it took me so long to finally commit to it. Cheryl, or Heather, or whatever name you'd like to call her, is also one of my favorite characters of all time in any media ever. And so writing about her in particular was kind of difficult because I didn't want to come across as too biased. Heather reminds me a lot of myself when I was a teenager, and even now. I mean, it's not like I'm a million years old, I'm only 23. And she reminds me much more of myself than any of the other women I've covered in this series, so I wanted to make extra sure I didn't spend the whole video just projecting onto one of my favorite characters. You know, as you do. Either way, I hope you all enjoyed this addition to the Women of Survival Horror series. I have plenty more I plan on covering in the future, so make sure to stay tuned for those. Scripts for these type of videos are by far the most time consuming, so in the meantime I will be making lots of other little videos, probably retrospectives about early to mid 2000s internet or pop culture things, so there's that to look forward to as well. So, as always, thank you for watching. I hope you all have a good day or night or whatever time it is wherever you are, and I will see you all next time.